Few peoples in the history of the world have been as successful at spreading their language and culture as the English. From a tiny nation on part of an island, they were able to become the world's leading power in the 18th and 19th century. They established the settlements which would become the United States and Canada, and their language has, for better or worse, become the New Latin. Yet perhaps like few other peoples in the world, the basis of their ethnic identity is constantly assailed, or even outright denied. So what is the truth? What are the actual genetic origins of the English? And what secrets lay hidden there that add another amazing chapter to their history? Now, to begin with, we have to understand that every ethnic group in the world is composed of a mixture of earlier groups. So while it's frequently trotted out that the English are not pure Anglo-Saxons, even the Japanese are a mixture of earlier peoples. Ethnic groups form through long historical processes and often many bloody events that result in the merger of previously separate groups. Sometimes these groups can be starkly different, but all the groups that make up the ancestry of the English people ultimately come from a very small geographical region. Now, these are some of the pie charts of the estimated genetic admixture of the English people from different regions of the country. Now, as you can see, the English are comprised of several identifiable populations, and the admixture varies depending on the region. So in the southeast, you have the strongest Anglo-Saxon contribution, as you might well imagine, while in the west and the north, that contribution decreases. Now, Anglo-Saxon genetics is not strictly what makes one English. English is an ethnic identity that formed in Britain during the conquest and subsequent political and historical events, and the genetic mixing of various groups. While linguistically, the core of the Germanic language retained dominance, many other elements are adopted from the British people, including the most well-known heroes like King Arthur, whose legend actually revolves around fighting the Anglo-Saxons. This is because ethnic identity isn't purely genetic, although there is usually a genetic component. It is more about a group identity and how that group sees itself. That identity becomes tied up with genetics because history and ancestry is involved. However, what we can also see in this pie chart is another element that's neither Anglo-Saxon or Brythonic. What is this population, and how did it come to play such a secret yet powerful role in the genetic origins of the English people? Now, while the English are a combination of various groups, it's fair to say that the core of their identity begins with the Germanic groups in Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, from where the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes would emerge. During the Roman period, the region would come under heavy imperial influence, and various Saxon groups would take up work with the empire as soldiers or foederati. These were the first Germanic peoples that we know that settled in Britain. They created altars to Mars Thingus, Mars of the Thing, known more famously as Tyr or Tew in Old English. It may have been these groups which acted to facilitate the later influx from the continent when Roman power waned. This is reflected in British legends, which say that Vortigern hired the forces of Hengist and Horsa as mercenaries against the Picts and the Scots. This Roman and post-Roman migration of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes was recognized in the legendary history and fits with the history, archaeology, and language. I cover this in detail in the video The Origins of the English, which I highly recommend. the migration was quite large and changed the genetic landscape of England. In early medieval English sites, samples show an approximate 86% Lower Saxony admixture present. 73% of the haplogroups associated with these sites were also of continental origin. Approximately equal amounts of men and women were migrating from the continent. In the later medieval period, these percentages would be reduced through further mixing with the local British population, but would remain significant. This initial wave was enough to establish the culture and language, and later to absorb a much broader population that over time had become culturally and linguistically assimilated through the English political dominance. However, the picture is much more complicated than this rather simplistic rundown suggests, for not all of that continental admixture was Anglo-Saxon. There was another massive addition to the English genetic pool. In a 2022 paper on the Anglo-Saxon migration, this ancestral component was identified as being similar to Iron Age France or Belgium-like. This ancestry was not present in the Iron Age or Roman period Britain, but appeared sometime during the early Middle Ages. Now, in my previous documentary, I suggested that the Norman invasion might have accounted for at least some of this, but in fact the admixture predates the Norman conquest. So who exactly were these people, and when did they arrive in Britain? During my research and production of the documentary on the origins of the Bretons, I believe that I came across the historical references to this, and they actually begin at a much earlier period than one might have believed. In the writings of Zosimos's New History, written in the first quarter of the 6th century in Constantinople, presumably working based on written imperial reports from decades and centuries earlier, he states, "Another of Emperor Probius's battles was against the Franks, whom he subdued through the good conduct of his commanders. All of them that were taken alive were sent to Britain, where they settled, and were subsequently very serviceable to the emperor when any insurrection broke out." Now, there is no indication here as to exactly how many Franks we're talking about being transported into Britain by the Roman Empire, but the numbers would be in the thousands, and likely tens of thousands. This took place during the reign of Probus, and thus necessarily sometime before 282 AD, though we have no idea where in Britain they were settled. Presumably, they were placed in built-up areas rather than being settled in their own distinctive towns, and thus didn't leave much of an archaeological footprint. But this resettlement appears to be only the first of what would be a wave of Frankish-related settlements within Britain. The English historian Bede, writing in 701, said, "In the year of our Lord 286, one Carausius, of very mean birth, but a man of great ability and energy, being appointed to guard the sea coast, then infested by Franks and Saxons, acted more to the prejudice than to the advantage of the Commonwealth, by not restoring to its owners any of the booty taken from the robbers, but keeping all to himself, thus giving rise to the suspicion that by intentional neglect he suffered the enemy to infest the frontiers." Again, it is not only the Saxons assailing the coasts of Britain and settling them, but the Franks. This is prior to the later wave of Angles by more than 100 years, and it's not impossible that colonies of Franks and Saxons were already established in parts of southeastern Britain long before those more famous events of Hengist and Horsa. In the Getica, for some unexplained reason, Jordanes begins his work with a description of Britain before moving on to Scandinavia. He then makes the following cryptic allusion. "We have read that on their first migration the Goths dwelt in the lands of Scythia, near Lake Maeotis. On the second migration, they went to Moesia, Thrace, and Dacia, and after their third, they dwelt again in Scythia, above the Sea of Pontus. Nor do we find anywhere in their written records legends which tell of their subjugation and slavery in Britain, or in some other island, or of their redemption by a certain man at the cost of a single horse. Of course, if anyone in our city says that the Goths had an origin different from that I have related, let him object. For myself, I prefer to believe what I have read, rather than put trust in old wives' tales. In other words, there was a myth floating about Constantinople that the Goths had their origins in Britain, that they had been slaves there who were released from bondage through some mysterious figure trading them for a horse. It sounds like the crossroads between legend and mythology. Was the figure who freed them Woden, perhaps? Unfortunately, the answers to these questions are lost in time, for no other surviving source mentions what Jordanes was referring to. Doubtless, he is right to reject the stories, but that such stories were circulating in his time, and had already reached the stage of being legends or mythology, means they must have been around for at least a few generations, suggesting that a heavy Germanic presence in Britain was known about for a long time in the empire, and this may correspond to the previously mentioned transfer of Franks into Roman Britain. Procopius, an East Roman court historian and legal advisor who actually traveled with the Roman general Belisarius, wrote about a very strange and indeed startling negotiation that took place between Belisarius and the Goths. Now, this was at a time when Emperor Julian was at the height of his power, and the Byzantines were trying to reconquer the West. Procopius says, "And the barbarians said, that everything which we have said is true, no one of you can be unaware. But in order that we may not seem to be contentious, we give up to you Sicily, great as it is, and of such wealth, seeing that without it you cannot possess Libya in security." And Belisarius replied, "And we on our side permit the Goths to have the whole of Britain, which is much larger than Sicily, and was subject to the Romans in early times. For it is only fair to make an equal return to those who first do a good deed or perform a kindness." Now, this wasn't a genuine offer. The Romans hadn't held Britain in a very long time, and this is the sarcastic joke that Belisarius is making, because at the time when the Goths are offering Sicily, he already possessed it militarily. So he is offering something that he doesn't have in exchange for them offering something that they don't have, right? And is being very witty about this. However, there could also be hidden here an implication that Belisarius actually thought that the Goths, or maybe one of their allied tribes, had control of Britain, right? Because they are offering something that he controls. So in response, perhaps, he is offering something that he thinks they control. This may relate to the enigmatic comments by Jordanes. Procopius also described Britain in his writing, saying, "The island of Britain is inhabited by 3 very numerous nations, each having one king over it. And the names of these nations are Angli, Frisones, and Britones, the last being named for the island itself. And so great appears to be the populations of these nations, that every year they emigrate thence in large companies with their women and children, and go to the land of the Franks. And the Franks allow them to settle in part of their land which appears to be more deserted. And by this means they say they are winning over the island. Thus it actually happened that not long ago the king of the Franks, in sending some of his intimates on an embassy to the Emperor Justinian in Byzantium, sent with them some of the Angli, thus seeking to establish his claim that this island was ruled by him. The population movements Procopius describes of English settling in Frankish lands may have been a mistaken reporting of the opposite. Procopius was never in the north himself, and his reporting on this is very confused. Very likely, what Procopius says is the opposite of what is actually happening, and he's just misinterpreting it. So rather than the Angli coming to settle in Frankish lands, it's rather that Franks were going to settle in areas in Britain, and were thus laying claim to Britain as a whole. And when they are sending certain Angli on diplomatic missions alongside Franks, that's because they were laying some claim over Britain, which was occupied also by the Angli, who were perhaps operating as sub-kings. Frankish migration into Britain at this time seems to be the primary origin of this Iron Age Gaulish-like ancestry that we see in the English population. Of course, the question becomes, why are the Franks plotting as Iron Age French? Now, I will provide a more detailed explanation in a future documentary on the Franks specifically, but the short answer here is that during the migration period, the Franks, along with the Goths, Lombards, and other migratory Germanic tribes, mixed heavily and rapidly with the population of Gaul, Iberia, and Italy. For example, I obtained a G25 PCA for an Iron Age individual from around 350 BC, Aude, France. It's a site along the Mediterranean and near the border with Spain. It's about the furthest genetically that you can get within Gaul from an Iron Age Germanic person. I then compared this individual to several hundred genetic samples from Europe between 200 and 750 AD. Surprisingly, some of the closest genetic matches were with migratory Germanic tribes. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Lombards, and likely even Saxons. The matches spanned from Portugal to Germany, seemingly tracking with the migration of these tribes. Some of the matches were even in England, and this is a clear demonstration that these Germanic tribes had very rapidly become genetically indistinguishable from Gauls, while the backflow into Germany and England demonstrates that they had maintained their tribal Germanic identities, despite genetic admixture. Thus, these migrants from France were not individuals coming as Gallo-Romans or Celts, but as part of a broader Germanic migration. Their identity was still of Germanic peoples, even as their genetic structure more closely mirrored that of Iron Age France. Thus, we have Britain occupied by the Angli, Saxons, and Frisians, while at the same time the Franks were trying to claim it for themselves. This isn't the only time the Frisians are mentioned in Britain either. Bede, writing about 200 years after Procopius, says,
"As soon, therefore, as he was recovered, he sold him to a certain Frisian in London."
Even in the time of Bede, it seems there were still Frisians dwelling in Britain. Now, perhaps a detractor could argue that this was a merchant and was only temporarily in London to buy slaves, but this goes beyond what Bede actually says, and given the other strains of evidence, is actually counterintuitive. What seems to be the case is that there were still separate populations of Frisians in regions of Britain as late as 700 AD. Yet this is not the last account of Procopius, for he also goes on to relate a story which must take place around 540. Hermegisclus, the king of the Warini, a Germanic tribe who lived in what is now northeast Germany, had a marriage alliance with the Franks, marrying the sister of King Theudebert. Now Hermegisclus had a son, Radagis, in an earlier marriage with a wife who died. He sought a marriage for him with the daughter of a king's brother of the Angli, one who was born in Britain. Now, this is a very significant detail because it shows that the Angles in Britain were still directly tied to their homeland in northern Germany at this time, as the Warini were a neighboring tribe to the Angli there, and therefore were trying to maintain their tribal alliances through this marriage. However, upon the king's untimely death, he willed it that his son, who had already been promised to an English maiden, should instead be wed to his widow, who was the sister of the Frankish king, as he deemed this alliance to be more important to them, given that the Angli were distant from them. However, the maiden of the Angli did not take this spurning lightly. She raised an army and crossed over the channel, landing at the mouth of the Rhine River. The Angles crushed the Warini, captured Radagast, and the maiden forced him to honor the original betrothal. Now, perhaps the tale is a bit fanciful, but it certainly isn't beyond the realm of possibility. Yet it emphasizes this close, continued connections between these various Germanic groups, which are not at all easy to separate. Could you genetically distinguish, for instance, between an Angli and a Warini? Not likely. Thus, there were very likely many different tribal groups operating in England, beyond the typically identified Angles and Saxons. Bede remarks frequently on the doings and history of the Franks, and recalled their very close connections with the kings of Kent. The kingdom of Kent was established primarily by the Jutes, and there is some speculation that they were originally under the political authority of the kingdom of Francia. King Ethelbert, who reigned from 589 to 616, was wed to Bertha, daughter of Heribert I, the Frankish king of Paris. These marriages were not romances. They were political alliances. Every last one of them. The marriage itself is thus a signed and dotted proof of a Kentish-Frankish alliance. But archaeological evidence also shows very close trade between Kent and the Franks, with an abundance of Frankish material throughout the kingdom. This heavy Frankish trade continued into the 7th and 8th centuries, flowing through ports at Fordwick and Dover. So the real picture of early Anglo-Saxon Britain is even more complicated than the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Britons. And this group would have a much larger genetic impact than a group like the Jutes or later groups like Scandinavian Vikings. But in Britain, these closely related Germanic groups would fuse together over time into what became the English. This Frankish and Frisian admixture, which has hitherto been relatively ignored or unknown, is another amazing chapter in the origins of the English people. Well, I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers, or become a member of the channel to get ad-free videos. You can also get ad-free videos by subscribing through Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, and as always, stand tall.